don't say yes to everything just to prove your worth. Like, I think the more that we can go into HR roles or people and culture roles and really own the strategic impact that this role has, the more impactful and influential we're going to be.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Plumm Pod, where we talk about all things HR and mental health. I'm your host, Georgia, founder of Access HR. On today's episode, we are joined by Natalie, and we talk about connection being a business strategy rather than just a nice to have. She is a culture, facilitation, and leadership expert and the co-founder of The Future Kind. So whether you're a seasoned HR professional or you're just wanting to get into the space, there are so many takeaways in this episode that you do not want to miss out on. And before we get into the episode, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. It then allows us to keep going with the conversation and have great guests every single week. Natalie, hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm very excited to be here.
Me too. This conversation I have been really looking forward to. So we first met in September, and ever since we first spoke, I knew you were exactly the guest that I wanted on this podcast.
Oh, that's so lovely to hear. The pressure's on now. I've got to perform.
No, naturally, this is your bread and butter. And for our audience, I would really love if we can get to understand a little bit more about you. So a question I love to ask every guest is, was HR the plan? Or did this happen by chance?
Oh my God, it wasn't the plan at all. So I did like an economics degree at uni because I was like, I want to make money. And that had money written on it. Didn't really know what it was about. I ended up doing a graduate scheme at a bank. And during that time, I went into like lots of different roles and randomly ended up in like user experience design and customer experience design. And again, kind of was like finding my way, figuring it out. I loved how human-centered it was. And then I got the opportunity to join a startup design agency as their third employee. And again, like still HR's not on, it's not on the radar at all. But I guess that was a tipping point where I started to see work differently. I had such a strong sense of belonging when I joined that tiny agency, and we were all doing a bit of everything as it is in startups. And I naturally gravitated towards people and culture elements. So I was like, okay, I'm going to design our onboarding experience, and I'll do it in the same way that we would do like a design project for our clients. So find out the needs of users, kind of test different ideas, iterate on feedback, and kind of go back round the circle. And I guess it was doing those little mini projects, something started to click. And I was like, oh, actually, culture is something that is built by intention. It's not something that happens by chance. And so when our little agency became big enough that we were setting up a leadership team, I was asked to be on the leadership team, and I was like, okay, cool. I want my role to be head of culture. Mm-hmm. And so that then opened up the world that I'm now in. So yeah, not planned at all.
I absolutely love that. And I also love that you're coming from the perspective from the user experience as well. And for anybody who doesn't follow Nat on LinkedIn, she is the co-founder of The Future Kind and started a business 2021 post-pandemic.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. I want to ask around the difference that you've seen in connection post-pandemic. The reason that I asked that is I've noticed such a difference with connection and what that looks like now, given the different work dynamics with hybrid working and also remote working. And I read a statistic recently from Gallup saying that colleagues are more likely to be engaged by 2.5% if they have that connection piece. And I wondered, are you experiencing that?
Yes, absolutely. So I was head of culture at the agency during the pandemic. And that was such an eye-opener in terms of what culture actually is and what connection actually is. I think that before the pandemic, a lot of companies, especially those that were reliant in the office, they like camaraderie, like the idea of like friendship and like social activities and things like that, that was almost like a front for like true connection and true culture. And so when the pandemic happened and like that in-office camaraderie was taken away, a lot of companies were left with not much to hold up their culture and hold up their connection between people. And so that's when we saw loads of people feeling lonely and isolated and disconnected from their jobs, and work almost became a bit transactional. So I think now, fast forward, like post-pandemic to some degree, I think connection is more important than ever, but I do think that it gets a bit of a bad rep because it feels like very touchy-feely, very like, you know, intangible. But I think connection between team members, that is the difference between a group of people with a shared goal and like a thriving team. The connection is the difference between them. So it is a strategic driver and not just like this nice, fluffy, nice to have.
I completely agree. And what I've noticed is when companies experienced the dynamic change during COVID and they transitioned over into a hybrid team or a remote team, they didn't prioritize connection and it wasn't intentional. And the ripple effects of that have gone into the team. And when you're talking around isolation and loneliness, if there are any leaders listening to this episode who are feeling a bit of a roadblock with their team and they're thinking, how can I overcome this? What does connection actually mean and what does that look like?
Yeah. So connection isn't one thing. Mm-hmm. It's a myriad of things within your company. And some of those, like in practice, connection might look like really small things, like a check-in at the start of your team meeting, asking everyone what energy they're bringing into the space today. It could be having virtual co-working opportunities. Mm-hmm. So a day every week or every month where everyone's in the same virtual room doing their work and kind of like chatting side of desks like you would usually. But those are kind of your micro moments. It also goes through to actually bringing people together. And I think that all leaders, if they want to build connection between their teammates, which I really encourage everyone to do, they should be thinking about the moments where they bring everyone together for an offsite, for a company retreat. And yes, these things are a big expense, but if you're a hybrid or a remote team, they are vital, really vital moments to kind of just get people connecting on a much deeper level. It's also an opportunity to take people out of their day-to-day and get them to connect over like some more general challenges that you might have in the team and build connection that way as well. Atlassian actually did some really interesting research around the impact of like team offsites, and they found that bringing people together just 4 times a year has, I think it was like 2 to 4 times bigger impact on connection and collaboration than kind of ad hoc office experiences or like ad hoc office attendance. And so I think, you know, when we talk about the return to office debate and things like that, yeah, sure, like there is bridging and bonding capital that can be achieved in an office, but that doesn't replace taking people outside of the office and bringing them together around socializing, connecting, but also thinking about some of those bigger problems to solve within your organization.
That statistic was really powerful as well.
Yeah.
And taking the team out. And I think that's such a missing piece. A lot of people are thinking, okay, we're a remote team. and that's enough, and it's stopping there. And as humans, we naturally thrive in connection. And I do believe, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, around communication being a really crucial part in building connection. Because I personally think as humans, we're terrible communicators. We are not taught how to communicate. It's a skill we get to work and we're told we should work on. And often we know our own communication style, but we don't know anyone else's, and we don't think about that. And that's where I think communication as being a thread for connection is so important. And when you don't have that, that's when you see a disconnect.
Definitely. I think communication is one of the biggest challenges that I see with the companies that I work with. And our communication has in some ways got worse since we've become more reliant on technology. So there's more misunderstandings, I believe, from, our kind of offhand messages on Slack and in email. Like, we can come across a lot more passive aggressive or like straight up aggressive in kind of written, like quick communication. And so I think, again, we do need to be really intentional about that. And I, for one, am really like bad for just sending a really quick message that comes across quite bluntly. Whereas if I send a voice note or a Loom video, that humanizes my communication. Like, my humor comes into it, my kind of like, my warmth comes into it, my friendliness, which you don't always get in the written message. So I have to really think about when I send like a Slack message versus when I'm going to take the time to do a voice note or a Loom. I think as well, from a leadership perspective, there is so much work to be done with regards to communication, especially in the hybrid setting. I think that as leaders, we really need to hold ourselves accountable to being as transparent with our communication as possible. And that means not leaving it to like being in the office and like a side of desk conversation in order to make a decision. If you're making a decision, make sure that it's communicated on the channels and visible so that people don't feel like they're left out. Or, if you're a remote employee, you're like, oh, I miss out on everything because I'm not in the office. I actually think that when it comes to communication, I would encourage leaders to design their communication rituals as though they're a fully remote company, because then you won't miss out on things. Because a fully remote company, documentation, following up, clarity, those things are so crucial. But sometimes if you're in a hybrid environment or an office environment, you kind of don't think that you need that. But I think the opposite is true. I think go remote first, like with that mindset, use those principles, and your communication will be so much better.
And the companies who aren't focusing on the remote first approach, they're the ones who are struggling.
100%.
And I'm definitely noticing that with my clients as well. I want to jump back a little bit to around the dopamine hit of instant messages. So we have Slack, we have Teams, we text each other, we've got WhatsApp now in the workplace. And a challenge that I see is particular around Gen Z. They like that dopamine. They've had all social media, and sometimes will, as an example, send a huddle straight away when they want an answer. Not everybody works like that. Sometimes it can make people feel a bit nervous. That's not their communication style. What's your opinion on how that can impact connection with the ways that we're now communicating through those social platforms?
Yes, this is a really interesting question because, when we were in office, you have this issue around presenteeism, like I'm going to stay at my desk until the most senior person leaves. But now in a kind of hybrid remote setting, we've got presenteeism, but in a different way. Like, I'm always going to be available to answer. And if I'm not, then that's an issue. So I think that you mentioned communication styles and preferences, and I really love that we're talking about this because we do all have different preferences. And I think it's really important to like make those visible. So for example, I hate a phone call. Like if you're calling me, it better be urgent, because like I don't even answer the phone to my mom unless she's like, text me first. Or like she knows now, that if it's a call, like I'm going to assume it's urgent. And other people, like especially across generations, a call is the quickest and easiest thing to do. So I really like, there's a brilliant book called The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. And the book is actually about communication preferences across like geographies.
Yep.
How like communication can differ. Like directness, for example, can be really different in Western cultures than it can be in Eastern cultures. So it's really interesting when we're working in like international teams like we are today. But it's also, I find the kind of pillars that she talks about really interesting from like an individual perspective. So I often bring the different pillars into my work with clients to say, let's actually talk about how you like to receive feedback.
Yes, I love that question.
Because everyone assumes that people want to receive feedback, like, tell me it. Actually, not everyone does. I have ADHD. I have, I can suffer with rejection, sensitivity, dysmorphia. And that means that sometimes it's better for me to receive feedback written. This is just my personal experience, right? Because it gives me time to reflect on it, to like really process it, and then I can come back with questions. Whereas sometimes if I get given feedback like in the moment and I'm not expecting it, I can be more defensive. So it's little things like that you're like, oh, why wouldn't you want feedback told to you directly and like face to face? And it's like, well, actually there's lots of reasons why people might not want that. So I think that as a team, it's really great to get everyone together and think about these different pillars of communication, whether it's feedback, whether it's decision-making, whether it's, how you build relationships, and actually mapping out how there's differences. So if you look at the book, they're like scales. And in every single team that I've done, I've introduced this to, everyone's all over. Like there's never like, everyone's on this side or everyone's on that side. It's always a spread. So that just shows how different our preferences are. And it means that you can adapt. Like if I'm going on to a conversation with you and I want to persuade you of something, I'm going to use your preferred method of communication because that's going to set you up for success. Whereas if it's vice versa, you would do the opposite. So it's about adapting in order to connect with the person that you're interacting with.
A big message as well for any leaders who are listening is a one size fits all, one size fits none.
Yes.
It doesn't work in any capacity. And if we are wanting to be intentional about the connection and how we enable our team to thrive, we need to be asking these core questions as well, because if we don't understand their preferences, what I see is then as leaders, they start to get frustrated. But the reality is they've not asked the right questions. And as a leader, I do believe that that's one of the core skills that we should get really good at, asking great questions to know more about our team and taking that coaching approach as well. And to your point on feedback, I think a really powerful question to ask somebody is, are you open to feedback? Because not everybody is as well. And when it comes to a point, a question I love to ask is, can I challenge you on that? Rather than going straight in. And those simple tweaks that we have also then reflects in our culture and everything else that we're building outside of this.
Yeah, 100%. I think that those two questions are really beautiful because also someone might not be open to feedback right now.
Yeah.
Like I've had a really bad day. No, I'm not ready for it. But like tomorrow, once I've like had some good sleep or like, this week's really busy, like just adapting in the moment, I think is so important. I also think that on the point of feedback, if you're a leader and you're thinking, what kind of training should I invest in for my team? Like a lot of leaders are going, oh, I need to get my team to be more resilient. They don't. You need to get better at communication and managing change. So that's one thing. But I think one of the best investments that leaders can make in training and growing their team is training around feedback, giving and receiving feedback, and embedding feedback as a practice into your day-to-day work, and it not just being an annual or biannual thing, because it really is. I like to think of feedback as a muscle. So like the more you practice, the stronger it gets.
Yeah.
So we need to practice it in our day-to-day, but we also need the tools and frameworks and kind of theory to ensure that it's as successful as it can be. So yeah, that would be another top tip, like invest in feedback training.
I love that. One of the challenges, especially if I think of our listeners and they will be listening to this thinking, okay, amazing tips, but my manager isn't open to feedback in any capacity. How would you, in your opinion, recommend for anybody who's facing that challenge with someone who just isn't open for feedback in any capacity?
Oh, it's challenging. That, to be totally clear, like that's a bad manager.
Yeah, I agree.
So apart from saying maybe you should leave, which is always my thing when there's bad managers, so my first tip would be consider how you're giving the feedback. So maybe look up some tools for giving really constructive, non-personal feedback. So a framework that I love is the COIN model for giving feedback. So that's an acronym and it stands for context, observation, impact, and next steps. So the idea is that it gets you to give really objective feedback that's grounded in like the behavior and the action and the impact that it had, rather than saying, you know, pointing fingers and saying you were rude or you were patronizing or whatever it was. So you would set the context. So in the project meeting on Monday, you would talk about the observation. So what was the behavior or the action that you saw? What was the impact it made me feel? Or my perception was, allow some back and forth about that, and then talk about next steps. So next time, how might we do this differently? I think that those types of frameworks, I mean, there's also SBI, situation, behavior, impact. I really like COIN because it has next steps attached to it, and it's kind of a collaborative invitation to work together. I'd say start there, see if that makes a difference. If it doesn't, I would consider what's your escalation point. It sounds like there's a development opportunity for your manager. So if there is someone that's above your manager, I would look at having a kind of private conversation about feedback that you would like to give, and if there's opportunity for them to work together. Because actually, if it is a development opportunity, it really should be their line manager that's working through that with them. If they're the top, if they're the CEO, I think that it's really hard to change people, especially like, you know, your managers. So at that point, I would kind of go back round and say, look, maybe this isn't the right space or environment for you, which is tricky.
It can be really hard, and I've faced that personally myself. I think one thing that's also really good to remember is 82% of managers are accidental managers.
Yes.
So when we're talking about the development of our managers, potentially they haven't received the training that we just talked about on receiving feedback. They don't know how to receive feedback. And there are loads of opportunities within work. And I think the number one thing that this all comes down to is that communication and the connection that we're building, but also with our intentions, because sometimes we're not open to the feedback, we can get defensive, and just being honest with our intentions of why I'm having that conversation.
Yeah.
I do think that can be really, really helpful. I want to talk about the role of being intentional of connection and how that can influence business performance.
So I think that in order to answer that question, I think we need to talk about like why connection is so important. And we've kind of touched on it through our conversation, but I guess to talk about that directly, when connection builds trust. And when there is trust between direct reports and leaders and between direct reports, we are more willing to collaborate. We're more willing to take risks. We're more willing to kind of all work together in those like crucial crunch point moments. And we're more willing to go over and above because we're part of a team and we care about each other. And, you know, if one of our teammates is struggling, but it's outside of our role, we're much more likely to jump in and support them. And that's what creates a really thriving, high-performing team. When you don't have that connection, we're more likely to see that culture and that camaraderie erode. We're more likely to see productivity go down because you might focus on your specific role, but not really worried about like what happens when you pass that along or when it goes to the next team or whatever that looks like. And I think you're more likely that people will leave because the relationship that person has with the job is much more transactional. Whereas when you feel connected and part of something, you've gone from like a transactional team delivering a service to a community. And we all know the power of community, right? So that kind of talks to the benefits. And I think to the business performance, if you have that environment where people feel connected, they trust each other, they work together really seamlessly, of course that means you're going to like deliver more and teams are more likely to meet their targets or exceed them. And I think also your customers and clients are likely to feel it. Like, you know, if people enjoy their work and they enjoy working with each other. And I think that over and above the fact that we go to work to get paid and to live, we stay at companies because we're part of something and we're surrounded by people that care about us and that we care about as well. So I think, like, with all of that in mind, it touches so much of an organization. So it really is a no-brainer that connection is like a driving force of business performance and success within a team.
Absolutely. The ripple effects that you've just spoken about as well is what every business owner needs to understand, I think, with connection, and they do need to be intentional about it. I'm going to ask one last question, if that's okay. So looking back at your career that you've had so far, what is the one piece of advice that you would give to your younger self or to somebody who is starting out in the HR space?
Good question. There's so many things, but I think the biggest one that comes to mind is don't spend all of your time trying to prove your worth by, like, don't say yes to everything just to prove your worth. Like, I think the more that we can go into HR roles or people and culture roles and really own the strategic impact that this role has, the more impactful and influential we're going to be, but it also does a service to the industry as a whole. I think that, you know, it less so, I do think this is changing, but I know that, you know, HR and people and culture has been kind of looked at like a lesser than department on a leadership team or like in an organization. And that has always been crazy to me because an organization is made by the people within it. So the department that is looking after those people and helping those people thrive, to me, is one of the, like, surely that's the most important team. So my advice to my younger self would be own it, own the worth that your role has. Don't let anyone tell you that it's not a crucial, important role. And yeah, back yourself in that.
Oh, I'm so here for that. I absolutely love it. And I wish I'd have had that advice when I was first starting as well. Oh God, today has been Amazing. Thank you so much for jumping on. And the value that we have in this episode is incredible. I know our listeners will absolutely love it and get so many takeaways. Thank you so much for joining us and have a good one.
Thank you for having me.